So this is basically a session about how we can hold the networks that we use accountable and the open source tooling and stuff that is useful on a technical side to do that, and then some of the policy thoughts around how we have gotten to where we are and the different forces that we're combating and why the internet is structured the way it is. I'm Will. I finished the PhD program at UW last year in the networking lab, and I'm starting a postdoc at University of Michigan in computer security stuff. Yeah, and my focus of that work has been sort of on the technical side, looking at online censorship, looking at how we can measure the internet, understand who is doing what sites are accessible or inaccessible where, and just trying to get more insight into this large system that we're using all the time. So what is accountability? Just to sort of start so that we're all in the same place. I think we all have sort of like had this thought of there was this whole SOPA thing when we were successful maybe, where the whole internet community sort of had this online protest. We really got behind it, called our representatives, and managed to prevent a set of laws that would have added additional regulation, additional restrictions on user-generated content and on what was online, and were able to sort of shift the public opinion in order to cause those not to get passed. And that we see that in sort of a bunch of major sites really went black. We've also had success in sort of having this grassroots accountability against companies, right? So when someone like Facebook or Google starts doing things that are really out of line with societal norms, you see these backlashes of public pressure on these companies forcing them to change policies. So there was a period, I mean, Facebook always gets dinged for its privacy policies, but there actually have been times where they've walked back steps, and same with Google, where it will do these things. People will get mad and say, well, actually, that's really limiting the way that I'm using these services, and then you'll see that changing. And so the question is, how do we maintain our ability to influence these norms, and how do we keep this internet that we all enjoy and use something that is conducive for our free open source environment, so that new projects can show up? It stays sort of this democratic thing that is for the users, as we continue to head down this road where all of the money is coming out of companies, and we have really more and more this dialogue between corporate players and governments, and the users are sort of being sold to somehow. And that's sort of, I don't know, the context here. So I want to start by spending a little bit of time talking about the regulatory landscape, focused on the US, but looking at sort of what all of this FCC stuff that we've heard in the news is actually sort of looking at, and then more specifically what is happening at a local level. So you've got a bunch of individual cities like Seattle and Tacoma and so forth who are then trying to have these laws on internet ISPs as well, in place of what they see the FCC not doing. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll move into sort of the meat technically, which is these projects for measuring what's actually happening so that we can respond to them. And then we'll finish by how those different pieces fit together and how we use these technical things to then come back to the policy side. Cool. And I'll leave some time at the end for questions. Feel free to interrupt if you want more detail on anything, or if there's anything else that I'm missing. I think this is meant for you guys to get something out of this, hopefully. So if you feel like you're not getting something, please make this for you. Cool. So what are the different pressures? So we've heard a lot about the FCC, right? This is the Federal Communications Commission, is this regulatory body that is somehow in charge of the internet as we use it in some sense. What does that really mean? The FCC has sort of a pretty broad mandate. One of those pieces of what it does is consumer protection. So it is meant to somehow set these regulatory things on our ISPs and carriers, but also on mail delivery and on a bunch of physical world things that happened earlier. So TV, radio, all of these other types of communication. The FCC is charged with basically having this environment where multiple people are able to compete fairly, dealing with sort of consumer rights at the same time, so making this a thing that isn't just a monopoly that wins. And so they get sort of the ability to fine these companies for not complying with regulations that they set. When you think about the bread and butter of what the FCC's been doing, it's these like spectrum auctions and figuring out what part of these constrained resources, like the RF spectrum, different companies and technologies get to use. So when you get into broadband internet and things that are using like cable, that are using these landlines, it's less of a constrained environment in FCC's sort of traditional bread and butter thing. So they've been hesitant to say, do we regulate this in the same way? Because it's not that multiple people are trying to use the same RF space and competing with each other directly. It's more, well, us Comcast, we laid all these cables and we're using it, and you could also lay your cables, is sort of this other argument of, well, this is constrained in a different way. At what point do we say, well, these local governments have given you monopolistic like cost concessions such that you were able to do this cheaper in order to blanket everyone, and so now you are the common infrastructure, and like telephones before, we're going to say you need to let other people use this infrastructure that is now a public service. So this is sort of the debate we're having. We've seen a lot of, very scared and scary articles in the news recently about how the FCC is going to undo net neutrality, that we're losing this. And so this is focused on a couple things. In 2015-ish, we saw regulation out of the FCC saying that they were going to start having broadband internet classified as a common carrier. So what is a common carrier? This is this sort of definition that isn't, there's no like one place you can go that just is like, this is what a common carrier is. Instead, it's like a bunch of different court rulings for the last 100 years, starting with packet transit of, okay, so we've got USPS, and now we've got these things like FedEx coming in, and they're also going to do package shipment. They're going to allow packages to be shipped from anyone. And so what sort of regulations do we need to put on these new companies? Because if we just sort of let them do it, they'll take the profitable segment of USPS, right? They'll deal with these high value packages, but they won't deliver to the rural areas because that's expensive and not worth it. And so what we'll end up with is USPS not making any money and failing, and then we end up with worse infrastructure. So at some point, these things grow big enough because there is this value to be made, and they are getting the value out of this segment of the market. And the government needs to say, well, we need you to play fair, and so we need you to also let us, have regulatory concessions so that we still get these things that we want for consumers, like ability to deliver packages everywhere. So there's a couple things that come out of that. One of the ones that we are seeing sort of being the crux of this net neutrality thing is that anyone is allowed to deliver, to sort of put packages into the system at the same cost. So if FedEx becomes classified as a common carrier, it means that USPS can also ship packages over FedEx if it wants, right? And FedEx can't say, well, you're our competitor, so we're going to charge you 5 times as much. That they have to allow, not based on who it is, everyone gets to use you. And you can't sort of have this anti-competitive thing where other systems can't use you. So there's this interoperability. And now what we're seeing that be, applied to in the internet context is, you need to still let Netflix send its videos over your line, even though you also have a video service. And so can you charge for different content providers more? It also basically says the users get to choose what they ship, so you can't look into it and say, well, since you're shipping, a typewriter, and we don't like typewriters because that's going to cause digital things, we're going to charge more for typewriters. That the different contents of what's inside need to sort of not matter, right? The things you are shipping you can vary by weight or something like that, but you can't be like, well, this is like a business letter, so for business letters we're going to charge 10 times as much because we know that's worth money. That you are held to some sort of common levels of not being able to care as much about the contents or who it is, and you're doing this sort of for everyone as a basic service. Okay, so at play in this current FCC world is how much we want to regulate ISPs. And the reality is not the FCC gets rid of this common carrier definition and then suddenly your data is like wholesale sold by all of these companies for, to the lowest bidder. That's not necessarily what's going to happen. Probably it's not going to be what happens because consumers would be super mad, and when the company just internally is looking at that business practice, hopefully it doesn't make sense to them. What we're really looking at is what sort of regulation at that bottom line do we want to ensure for our ISPs? So do we need to say, Comcast, you need to serve everyone, or do we give them these opportunities to innovate where, yeah, Google is going to pay Comcast a bunch of money to make Google really fast, right? This could be an opportunity. It could move Google forward. We get new lines faster because it's clearly economically advantageous for Google to put a bunch of money or whatever Netflix, some specific carrier, is going to be super happy to pay for interconnect bandwidth to get this new gigabit for itself. And that's a much easier thing for it to swallow than we're going to put a bunch of money into infrastructure that everyone gets to use, right? If they see this competitive advantage, maybe they're going to be more willing to invest in that infrastructure. So this is the argument that the Republican side is making, right? This is the we should not regulate, the industry is going to regulate itself side, right? They're saying we're going to get some small percentage of these new innovative services that are going to be able to move faster because they get to without having to spread that out. And on the other side, which is what we saw on the Obama era more, was, well, we need everyone to have access, and we want new players who don't have that money to invest to also take advantage, because it's these new services in the internet side that we keep seeing doing cool new things. And the internet as this common platform means that they can have this equal platform and can then sort of quickly expand because they don't have to then relay their lines or pay some huge amount of money to the existing players. So this is the balance that we're trying to find is how much of that common ground we want to see on the internet. And right now we're seeing that the current FCC administration is rolling back the protections. And so some of these, like, we're going to likely see a reclassification away from common carrier pretty soon in this year. We already saw a Trump executive order in February that undid this thing about whether ISPs can sell user data. That was, again, sort of made to look very scary if you saw it. Basically what it was doing was near the end of the previous administration, they were scheduling these rules to go into effect, and now they will never go into effect. But it's not rules that we have had in the past ever either. So it's whether we were going to do that in this year or not, and now we're no longer going to put these into effect. So companies have always been able to sell our data, and now will continue to be able to sell our data, is the state of the world. Now, filling in that gap, a bunch of cities and more local provinces or governments have said, well, maybe that was a good idea, and maybe we have leverage to do this instead of the full federal government. So if you look at Seattle, which is the location I am most familiar with, we have a bunch of protection things for consumers that as the local government has set up, it has entailed. So there is a cable customer bill of rights, which says that as a cable operator, you need to, be responsive to customer phone calls for support. And also that there's some privacy restrictions about you can't sell, what channels your users are looking at in specific ways, or use them in some ways. And a couple years ago, the Comcast franchise in Seattle got renewed for another 10 years, right? So this is, again, at the local level, doing something very similar to what I was talking about at the federal level. Seattle said, we will give you guaranteed lowest cost, so we won't let anyone else lay cable lines in the city for cheaper than you can. So if we let someone else lay their fiber and say, you can do this and we will charge you, $100 per block for digging up a street, and you can do that, then we have to also give Comcast the option to do the same thing. So Comcast gets sort of preferred customer status that we promise not to undersell you. In exchange, you need to comply with some regulations. And those regulations typically are access, of saying you need to be willing to provide service to everyone in the city. So you can't just do downtown. But if someone in South Center who's still in the city limits wants your service, you need to pay that more expensive cost to get them service too. Because we want all of our citizens in our city to have access to internet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you these concessions, like you can dig up our roads, or you can use the common telephone lines that are government-owned property, and we will charge you less. But in exchange, you have to be willing to serve anyone who wants your service. And so when you look at that negotiation of what they're trying to get, it's things like libraries all get $10 per month internet, and like senior centers will get this discounted rate, and we will have these low-income tiered buckets. These are the things that the city has traditionally been negotiating for, is getting access to everyone. Right? So again, are we expanding out and doing something that is less cost efficient for these providers? In the wake of this most recent FCC thing, Seattle passed a regulation saying, we are basically going to take the wording of that FCC regulation and we're going to apply this to our cable TV franchises as a thing that they have to comply with. So they need to obtain permission from their users before they sell any web browsing history. So if they're looking at what web requests are going over your pipe, they need to somehow get explicit consent from you. Who knows how that's actually going to happen, before they can sell this to third parties.
So I have a question. So they can Seattle's trying to modify the existing franchise contract with an additional requirement that wasn't negotiated before?
I think they get, yeah, so I think the basic...
It was just announced a couple of days ago.
Yeah,
so.
it was just announced. I think basically the deal is that they get some ability to do regulation authority as part of that franchise for people operating. And so they can have these new rules that they put in. It's not modifying the contract per se, like directly, where they need new signatures or something, but it's like you're operating within our jurisdiction, and we can have these penalties to fine you or say you're not in compliance anymore if you aren't compliant. But the companies that they have leverage over are these cable providers who are in these franchise agreements where they're getting something out of the city. So this doesn't apply to AT&T and Verizon and any of our cell providers who have built their cell towers on private buildings primarily, right? So when you look at how our wireless and cell providers are working, they'll go to these real estate developers and they'll say, you've got a pretty nice building, can we put a microcell on top of it? And that's a purely private agreement where the city isn't involved at all, right? Those national wireless or cell providers are primarily dealing with FCC only because they have spectrum regulations about airspace, but that's an agreement between them and the federal government, not between them and the municipalities. Okay. So the other thing that I think, okay, yeah.
Do you know if the ISPs can deny you service if you don't let them sell your browsing history? Like hide it in their subscriber agreement, and you have to agree to the subscriber agreement in order to use their service?
So I think in something like Seattle with this sort of thing, I think the expectation is no. I think the problem is when you get out to rural areas and places where there actually is this monopoly situation where there's one provider, you may find yourself in a situation where you either are paying this company that is going to do this or you don't have internet. And then you're in sort of a much harder position. I think in most of these municipality, more urban areas, we're unlikely to see this happen anytime soon because there is this competition and it's pretty clear to these companies that there is this degree of user feeling uncomfortable about having their data sold.
So they're automatically opted out of selling.
Right. So the city rules are saying by default you're opted out and you need to opt in. You need to consent somehow explicitly before we're allowed to do this.
And this means more than you need to send us, the postcard within 30 days of starting service in order to explicitly opt out, right? That it actually has to be an opt-in process. So we'll see. Maybe that's a click-through as part of your sign-up that, you have to you just sort of keep clicking and oops. But for now, you're good. So the other thing that motivates these players is corporate liability. And this is a lot of sort of the other side, is the companies that are in this space don't want to get sued and don't want to have people mad at them. And so they think about this in terms of liability. And this is what causes us to get this more restrictive side of things not being allowed or things being sort of disincentivized, right? And so this is things like defamation, libel, slander. So if a newspaper posts something that is mean to someone, they could face a lawsuit. Or if Google has content on it that someone gets mad at, they could sue Google for hosting this content that they say is untrue about them. You've got companies worried about the government coming after them and doing investigations for terrorism or things of that nature, right? If I have, a chat program or whatever, and it gets used by people for nefarious purposes, I am at much more risk of someone now saying, you have all this content that is part of our investigation, you need to comply with our investigation, and that's expensive. So if you have a platform like Facebook or Google or whatever, you're going to try and shape your community norms so you don't have this problem in the first place. You're going to try and limit the content that you're accepting to not face security problems or copyright violation problems. This other one, SIPA, is the Child Protection Act, right? If you have content that the government can say is targeted at children 13 or under, or you allow signups of users 13 or under knowingly, you now face a lot more regulation and scrutiny of what you're doing. And there's a bunch of liability that comes with that in the form of being able to be sued for showing inappropriate content to them, for releasing any of their private information for children. So if you get hacked, this is now a big problem for you because the government can take large amounts of money from you for losing children's information. A lot of how FTC, Federal Trade Commission, and these consumer protection agencies have sort of gone after a bunch of internet services traditionally has been under the SIPA Act because it is very strong. So if you have a service and we can show that children are using it, then you get to be held to a much higher standard. And so if you do other things that we don't like, we go after you with SIPA and say, you aren't doing a good job of protecting children, shape up, pay us a bunch of money. So this gets used as a stick some. But these are the things that cause us to have a much more restricted space online, right? These are the things that are motivating Facebook and how it's shaping its platform, or Twitter, or Google, or any of these walled garden platforms that we use, is that they like user comments and discussion because that drives engagement and you look at more of their ads and you buy more things. But they'd really like that to be you talking about products that you will buy rather than you talking about anything, including these things that could get them in trouble. So there's a lot of incentives against neutrality and allowing users to talk about whatever they want, right? For the companies, this is about getting money. How do they maximize revenue? Well, they maximize revenue by showing you things that are expensive or that they make money off of, like videos and traditional media streams. And if you don't have neutrality, then these big players who have the money to pay ISPs more, they're pretty happy about this too, right? So the ISPs are happy because they get less regulation. They don't have to go out to all of these places as much. The companies are happy because, as Netflix, yeah, I've got the money to pay for that top tier, and now someone new can't come and easily compete with me. And potentially, from the government's perspective, well, cool, innovation happens, right? That Google's going to pay a huge amount of money to get this new thing, or we're going to have satellites now, or whatever. So there's a bunch of incentives that are pulling us away from a neutral internet at all of these different levels, from that consumer walled garden space, and then from the ISP space. Right, we have why do we want to allow any content and common carrier? Well, because that has a lot of risk for the companies, and it means that it's harder for us to watch what's actually happening because this is now sort of this unenclosed space. So there are these forces, and it's worth understanding these forces, and now we need to figure out how we push back and say, well, but really we want a neutral internet, and really we want a place where we understand that this innovation is coming from new services starting up, and in order for them to do that, there needs to be this very level playing ground. Okay. Part 2, technical responses. How we hold the internet accountable. So I'm going to talk about 4 different technical projects that are going on that monitor different parts of the internet and that provide accountability and let us see what is actually happening. And this is at the technical level because one of the things that is, I think, proven useful is being able to talk about this stuff from a point of having data. If I am just arguing about policy and saying, well, that's bad, it's really a lot harder to have that, to win that argument because from this previous side, we've just seen that there are pretty reasonable arguments on both sides. And it's really sort of this someone trying to think about, well, okay, which of these seems like a good way going forward? If we have data to throw at it and say, well, look, when you do this, it goes down, that's a thing that's much harder to argue with. So the first thing I want to talk about is a project called OONI, the Open Observatory of Network Interference. This is a project affiliated with Tor, the anonymity network, and is looking specifically at online censorship. So can we find the technical infrastructure that is blocking content? Can we watch where that is around the world? Can we see what it is blocking? This year they came out with mobile apps for Android and iOS. You can download this, it's called OONI. And basically you run it and it tries a bunch of web requests and it looks for a few things. It looks for, are there proxies that are obviously watching the content that you're accessing? And so for typically not ISP level, but for coffee shop or corporate proxy. So if you're within a corporation, a school, one of these smaller organizations. And then in some countries at a national level, you see these devices that are really actively sort of processing all web requests. So whenever I make a request, this box sort of looks at the contents of the request I'm making and then forwards it on. And if you make weird requests, you can notice that the request you made that the server saw is slightly different from the request you actually made. And so it's looking for these. It's doing speed tests to see how fast of a connection you're getting to different places. And it looks for specific websites that don't load, that should load. And so they've got a list of websites that are considered sensitive sort of in different places around the world that they'll ping and see if they can connect to. This is sort of their web console where you can tell, for common things like a WhatsApp or for vanilla, for these proxy systems, do they work? And you can go to their website and then see where they see instances of censorship. So, a bunch of countries are actively blocking content. This is more sort of that, I think, the last round of internet freedom where we were looking at, the traditional China is blocking things and, Russia is blocking things, and we've got our West free world versus these censoring repressive states. And I think the battle that we are fighting now is a different one, and these tools are trying to catch up to that. But we're still in this world of saying, okay, so there's this person in the network that is explicitly blocking my access to information. And this is still a valuable thing to be able to monitor, although it's not something that I think we would expect to happen in the US super soon. Yeah?
What does it mean by vendors identified?
So this is, these things are saying we were able to see that there is one of these boxes and we know who made it. So there's these companies like Bluecoat and Finfisher, which are Western companies that sell proxy devices that countries like Russia and India and the Middle East buy and then use to block content. And so one of the sort of then responses from activists is saying, well, these companies that are operating within our set of social norms in a liberal Western Europe that believes that access to information should be free are selling these tools that are used to block access to information. And why are we providing the technical capacity to these people that we're calling repressive to be repressive? We should hold these companies accountable and tell them not to sell to these people. And so they're trying to chart who actually has this and are you going against any of these trade embargoes and are you sort of actually behaving as a good corporate citizen or not?
I think the useful base tools that have come out of OONI,
there is a C library that's being used sort of under the hood that it uses for all of its measurements called Measurement Kit that is a pretty reasonable basic framework for conducting internet measurements and for sort of doing measurements from a broad set of devices around the internet. And that is a tool that is, if you are thinking of trying to get measurements of the internet, this is a great place to start. Because adding modules to that to measure new things means that it can sort of then get adopted by a lot of existing users. There's also a URL list that sort of is maintained by a group called Citizen Lab, which operates out of University of Toronto. And that is basically the list of what websites maybe are on the verge of being blocked or manipulated by different governments. So it has basically segments for each country. And it is an interesting place to look at of what are the sites that are sort of on this edge where we're watching for them as test cases. And it ends up being sort of a hand-curated list by a bunch of political scientists of, well, gay rights is an issue in this country, so we're going to have a couple, pretty vanilla like sites in that range, or it's pornography, so we're going to have, some softcore porn sites in this country that we're watching to see if these get blocked. It's an indication that policy is changing. Cool. Satellite is a project that I worked on as part of my PhD. This is looking at specifically do websites resolve and where do they resolve to. And so you're able to see a couple things. You're able to see, this is in Iran, how many websites are blocked over time from outside. So I've got a single server running at University of Washington, and it has this sort of graph for a bunch of different countries. And the interesting thing that you get out of this is two things. One is I'm not putting people at risk. There's no one in Iran running measurements, which is nice. But that's purely on the censorship side. The other thing that's interesting is you get the sense of where are people located running. So for Google, where are Google's servers? Where has its CDN expanded to, and who is it peering with? This is a nice thing to know. And so we want to watch companies where they physically are and where users get to see them. And so this is now, I think, still looking more at the worldwide internet. So this question that sort of, I think, goes back to local more is if Facebook expands into China and is complying with Chinese policy to take down things, they're now accepting not only the restrictions and regulations that they're getting from the US, but also the restrictions and regulations they're getting from China or from Turkey. And you see this sort of calculus of the companies that are now, for the broad media platforms that we're using regularly, are mostly international. They have to make these decisions about content not simply under a US law and regulation system, but under 200 different regulation systems from all of the different countries that have users and apply pressure to them. So it's really interesting to watch, okay, so Twitter suddenly now has servers in Turkey, and guess what? They've also started to remove a bunch of tweets from Turkish users. Watching them remove the tweets from Turkish users is pretty hard because it's within their walled garden, and they will rate limit you, especially with things like Facebook where it's not public. It's really hard for us to watch and see what content is allowed and is not, right, in a data-driven way, because that's something that is private within their platform, right? I can't tell if a specific Facebook community has been somehow closed because the community was not necessarily public in the first place. But what I can see is, has Facebook expanded to another country? And if it has, and it has physical infrastructure there, that's a pretty good indication that it's now complying with the regulations from that country. So we're a level off from direct measurement of, well, what norms are you allowing? But it's some level of insight.
to give you a taste of how this works,
there are a bunch of DNS resolvers around the world. There's roughly 8 million of them. And so I can look up where is Facebook.com from all of these DNS resolvers, and they'll tell me what they see. So I find a DNS server in Turkey, and I say, hey, you, tell me who Facebook is, and it will say, oh, it's this IP address, and I can look at where that IP address is, and then I can figure out, okay, so people in Turkey probably see Facebook at this IP address. And so the basic thing is we're looking at a little over 1 million different ISP networks, and we every week we look up the top 10,000 domains that Alexa knows about on all of them, and we see where everyone thinks all of these domains are. We've got 3 or 4 years of data of that answer, and then some analysis that are up online.
Cool. The third project is a thing called Measurement Lab, or MLAB. This is a collaboration between a bunch of people at Google and a bunch of people at Open Text Institute, which is this weird policy group. And it is specifically trying to get better speed data and look at net neutrality. So we're going to now look at this, are we getting this level playing field in terms of speed for different services? The basic argument of why we need this project is when I go to speedtest.net, what am I actually looking at, right? I get 50 megabytes. Great. What does that mean? Well, speedtest.net, it turns out, is this company that has servers that you are hitting, and those servers are owned actually by your ISP. So Comcast has said, oh, hey, Speedtest, we're happy to host your speedtest.net servers, and we'll put them in Comcast. And so you get 50 megabits per second from your house to your ISP. But does that really mean that you get 50 megabits per second from your house to the website that you're going to? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. And so a study that came out in 2015 by them called the ISP Interconnection and its Impact on Consumer Internet Performance was saying that it's really the place between the ISPs that is the bottleneck. The reason why my internet might be slow is not from me to Comcast. That's going to be fine, probably. They've got a big enough pipe there. But they are not paying enough to connect to the next people on. And they're not paying enough because, well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. So it has a bunch of graphs in it. But this was sort of this argument that they were trying to make to the government for more regulation, saying, well, look, when we look at these ISPs going up to from Cogent, which is one of these backbone providers, we see that for a while they just sort of went down. Like they had the bandwidth, and then for a period of like a year, there's way less bandwidth, and that was also the period where Netflix was getting a bunch of pressure to pay money to the content providers, and then Netflix started paying money, and then suddenly there's more bandwidth again. And this feels a little sketchy somehow. Like they had the bandwidth and we're just sort of holding out on it. And the basic argument is, well, okay, so you've got this cable where you are connecting between Comcast and Level 3 or Cogent or one of these backbone providers that has a bunch of service data, and maybe there is more traffic that wants to go across that link than that cable. And you've got a network that is passing a huge amount of traffic, and they have a network that is passing a huge amount of traffic. And are you going to put another cable in to get more traffic to go back and forth? Well, you could do that, or you could say, hey, you should pay us a bunch of money so that we do that. And it turned out that a bunch of consumer ISPs have been, so the Comcast and Time Warner Cable and whatever of the world have been pressuring these companies and saying, hey, in order for us to build out this infrastructure that's expensive for us, you should give us a bunch of money. And the content providers like Netflix and Facebook and whatever are saying, well, no, this is not the way we've always done it. The traffic both ways is about equal, and so this should be the traditional free pairing agreement where neither of us pay money to each other, and we just keep putting in cables because we have more traffic. But the traffic's going both ways. Like, people want this, they're paying you. Our people are delivering the content and are paying us. We should be interconnecting to keep the service up. But the arguments from Comcast and people is, well, our eyes are very valuable to you. You are making money off of, your customers are making money off of our customers and clearly want the bandwidth. So you should give us money. And that continues to be this debate. But Measurement Lab is putting servers for speed tests at these interconnection points and on both sides and trying to do speed tests to something further away than your local ISP so that you understand the speed not into Comcast, but the speed across Comcast to the next hop. And so things like the OONI speed test are using their servers, a bunch of sort of the next generation of speed test that you use. If you use Netflix's fast.net speed test, you're now hitting servers that are sort of past your local ISP and getting a sense of what is your internet speed, not into your ISP, so not like that link from your home to the cable company, but your link actually to some service provider that you might want that is further away. And this has been, I think, a useful thing to understand from a policy side, right? That this is a problem. And you can also understand why this is a Google-driven process, because YouTube is a lot of bandwidth, and Google would really like to put pressure back on the ISPs to say, well, hey, we shouldn't necessarily be paying. We should keep this free peering thing. Look, it's these bad cable companies like Comcast that are trying to charge money and are holding out on putting in these cables so that you can get YouTube. And the answer shouldn't be, us Google have to pay Comcast. The answer should be, we should have some regulations where Comcast has to like put in these cables for free for us. Cool. The fourth thing is Teardrop. You've probably heard about this. This is a leaking platform for whistleblowing that is run by a bunch of newspapers. And it's also open source, like all of these. And I think the thing that is interesting is we are learning a lot about proposed laws and about sort of trade processes through whistleblowing, right? Like the way that we are preparing our community responses to things like SOPA and to changes to neutrality laws and able to have demonstrations against them is not by like seeing them when they actually get proposed, but by seeing them a couple months earlier when someone leaks them to the press and the articles actually come up in time to prepare a response. So having this back channel to learn about these things earlier seems to be the way that you get public comment on regulation at this point. Like this over the last couple of years seems to be the new normal of the way that the public like gets to have its angry reaction in a way that sets policy in a proactive rather than responsive way is through a whistleblowing process, which is weird. It feels a little messed up, but seems to be the reality, right? And that would be an indication that maybe we should work on these tools and make sure that they are, working and plausible to use so that we can maintain this civil discourse. Cool. So, how do we take tools? How do we then do something useful with them and go back to shape policy? So taking this around. The things that we learned from this first generation of internet freedom, from looking at repressive countries, censorship today typically has a legal basis. So when I look at China and say, you are blocking all these websites and that's like a repressive thing, they'll say, no, look, we've got this all written out, it's totally legal. Like, and there's very little blocking of content or manipulation content or sort of limiting foreign access to things that is somehow illegal or that we're going to call out and say, look at this, you're doing this horrible thing. And the regulators will say, yeah, it's regulated. This is policy, like we voted on it. This is cool. What's the problem? And so we need something more than just sort of calling this out to shape that. Censorship and these restrictions around the world are much more often implemented by private actors, right? When I can't get to something, it's not because of some server that a government is running that is blocking the access or slowing it down. It's because Comcast or someone has decided that this isn't in their interest, right? The reason I can't get to Facebook, to see, pornography is because Facebook has decided I can't see it.
right? It's not the government blocking this because of some social norm that they have. It's Facebook deciding they don't want to put up with the liability and risk, and therefore just deleting it proactively before they get any complaints from the government. Political speech is going to continue to be one of the main triggers where you look at new stuff happening, right? We've seen this play out in our election and hacking, and now a counter sort of push towards free press, right? We're maybe doing criminal charges against WikiLeaks. Stephen Colbert is now being investigated for joking about Trump. We're going to continue to see political speech as sort of the place that we're testing this, because this is the battleground for political stability, which is something that's very important to a bunch of countries. And then I think the final point that is pretty clear is that when you look at these walled gardens, the Facebook, the Twitter, the Instagram, whatever of the world, it's much harder to understand what they're actually blocking, right? They'll give you these sort of fluffy statements about their community norms and what sorts of content are okay. But if you want to actually understand from a data source what they're actually doing, like what content actually is getting taken down, that's something that they know and aren't going to tell you, right? I don't know how many tweets Twitter has deleted. I don't know how many posts Facebook has deleted. What does it mean for Facebook to have even deleted a post? Because Facebook doesn't delete posts. Facebook just makes the post not seen on other people's walls, right? I still have posted it. And maybe if I look at it, I can still see it. It just didn't show up on my friend's stream because their machine learning algorithm decided it was not a thing that would get you to look at it and look at their ads. So there's these very weird gray lines that are very hard for us to have any accountability of, well, but that was actually an important thing, and so maybe you should have shown that because I cared about it. These lines start to get very gray, and we have very little insight of the discussions that we want to have being somehow manipulated. So I'm basically done, but let's finish with sort of what we want to get out of this and how we might want to do that. So how do we keep the internet a place that is conducive for new free open source software involvement, where new projects can show up, where we get reasonably low prices as consumers, and where we can express the ideas that we want in a sort of community way? Is the strategy to have these sort of big campaigns where we get everyone on board and set regulations? I think that's part of it, right? We have had a lot of success with grassroots campaigns, like I was saying at the beginning. And if we think about ourselves as the community that is not only wanting to make new projects, but also is the development community that is employed at all of these companies, then we as individuals can pressure the companies to change this, right? So we as a community are in a pretty important place in terms of setting the policy for this, because there is so much self-regulation of the industry. And you have seen that, the blackout by Google, where they showed this on their main screen against SOPA, was not because Google decided this was in Google, the company's interest. It was because all of the employees at Google said, we really don't want this. Google, the company, because we, the employees, don't want this, you need to do this. So there's a big movement right now called Tech Solidarity that came out of Pinterest, where a bunch of Silicon Valley companies are trying to say, well, look, we need to do something about this in a self-regulated way because no one else is doing it for us. And maybe that gets us somewhere. As individuals, I think there's a bunch of things we can do. Collect measurements, so having data, watching for things changing technically and yelling about them so that more people can go on and look and say, well, this changed and this is bad. We need to actually understand technically when neutrality gets violated so that we can actually have that in a responsive battle rather than 2 years down the line trying to argue, hey, what you did back then was bad. As individuals, adopt journalists, so find journalists who are writing about this stuff and help educate them. It's pretty easy. If you email them, they get very excited because they also want technical people to answer questions and interview and so forth. Call your representatives. If you fax them or call them, they actually get very excited because that's how they communicate. Email doesn't work quite as well. And then as a technical community, we can build the services and get our users invested, and that's then how you cause this to grow, right? Is that we have communities, the communities care. Now there's many more people who care, right? We as developers and as this community of technical people have the ability to force multiply our impact by involving the people around us. And then for neutrality specifically, use VPNs, encrypt your traffic, make it hard for them to differentiate, then it's less valuable for them to do shitty stuff. Cool. We've got like 5-8 minutes for questions if people have other things they want me to talk about.
I think we're all waiting. Like, I don't want to be that guy who monopolizes this time. People probably have better questions than me.
Go for it.
Be that guy.
Oh, that guy. Oh. I hate VPNs. Like, I love the idea of VPNs, but it's taking money that didn't go to anyone, and now it's going to someone who like willfully violates the law in the country.
Okay.
So for a long time, the argument against music piracy, in the 90s, was that it's funding terrorism. Which it's not funding terrorism. It's funding nobody, and kids get to listen to music. But with VPNs mixed in, now it's funding somebody I don't know who is blatantly saying, let's dodge the laws. And
So I think this is true in two ways. So VPNs, should we actually use VPNs? What does that mean? There are a lot of sketchy VPNs in multiple ways. I think there's this, I don't know if it's a new wave, but the thing I would recommend for VPNs is there's these things like Algo, which are basically grab some cloud machine somewhere in the cloud that's closer to the core of the internet and doesn't have a consumer ISP that's messing it up. Get a VPS there and send your traffic there before it goes out to the rest of the internet. And it'll be pretty fast because these cloud services are meant to be pretty fast. And you're now not trusting some sketch VPN, you're trusting whichever of these big cloud providers it is that you're paying a pretty small amount of money for, and you can share it, right? For my $5 a month DigitalOcean or Amazon or Google or Microsoft VM, probably 4 or 5 people can use that same connection. So I can share it with family and friends, and I get $1 or $2 amortized per month as opposed to 5.
Can you spell that out?
ALGO, Algo, is.
.com or
I think if you search for Algo VPN, you will find this. This is basically a piece of software that says, here is a guide for how you sign up for Amazon and upload this image that has OpenVPN running on it, and here's how you then connect your phone and your computer to use your VM. So trying to make it easier to do that setup.
Just two things where I think it's a very good presentation, but I think two things you were showing maybe are a little more gray than what you were indicating.
Yes, sure.
So for example, when you're talking about private actors versus state actors, and you're saying it may not be the state that's doing this, it may be Facebook or Google. And I would dispute your dichotomy because I'm not sure that there are bright lines dividing these entities because your state and your large corporate actors are probably smudged.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's very, very gray, and it's kind of misleading to say that this is a private actor doing this versus the state because they're all more or less all together. And the second thing I wanted to point out is it's also not quite that simple on the censorship thing because if I were to take it back historically, way, way back, and let's say the Trojans put in an ordinance during their siege by the Greeks, and they say, we don't want any non-domestic art permitted inside the walls of Troy. And the Greeks say, well, we'd really like to bring in this, we have this horse we'd like to bring inside your walls, and this is just a form of art. And they say, no, we are making sure we don't have this kind of art coming in. And the fact of the matter is that it is a Trojan horse. That this thing that's being brought in, just like some things that are being put out into foreign countries are in fact propaganda, or they are intended to be subversive, and they are directed at China or at Iran or at other places or at us. And so it's very, very difficult to simply say some things, all of this is censorship, whereas in fact it may be protected, because in fact what's being censored is in fact aggressive. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing based on what you can just glean from everyday living, that things are not quite that simple.
I think that's totally true. I guess I think there's two things, right? So on the
is this company versus is this government, and how intertwined are they? I think the point that is worth remembering and being aware of is when we are putting pressure or trying to change policy, it's not purely one or the other, but we need to be thinking about both of these and what motivates them. So if you're looking at strategy for how do we get Facebook to open up, and like let me download all my data or make some open platform, this isn't going to be, you know, is this going to be I pressure the US government to say this now needs to be a regulation that your companies comply with? That seems pretty Herculean. Maybe I target Facebook directly and say, look, your policy's bad, because then their lawyers are going to talk to the government lawyers and figure something out. And so you can put the pressure on the companies or you can put the pressure on the government, and you just need to figure out which of these you have better leverage and better arguments against. But both are, there's definitely a negotiation happening between those two players, at least, and you need to figure out how that negotiation is happening and then counter pressure. And then on censorship, yeah, absolutely. There's national security bases, right? There is a reason why this is happening. It's not just to make us unhappy or to keep us from, you know, enjoying good things. I think the point I would argue is that the internet came out and was this great utopia of we're going to move past the previous level of things, and now we're back to where we were, and we should try to hold on to this ability to say individual person-to-person communication is a thing that, you know, we have gained from the internet. Let's keep that being a thing that is unrestricted, where if I am talking to someone I know on the internet, I should be able to say what I want, right? That is my First Amendment right. It is like saying it in person, and we should hold firm to that being a thing. The ability to then broadcast that on a large platform is something that is much more gray, right? So do I get to promote my news article about my Trojan horse? Well, that's one thing. But should I be able to talk to my friend and say something that is bad about the government? Yeah, probably. I would say that that's true. I don't want some company, just because I'm saying it over their wire, to then like stop me from saying it. Right? Now, for any means of communication, we've certainly had wiretapping and we've had government surveillance, and that will continue. And there are ways that will happen, right? And we can have an argument about how hard we should make that. So does the government get to watch the wire and watch all the traffic passing through it and automatically extract the things that they think are bad and then surveil those people more explicitly? Or do they have to hack individual end devices and watch on the end device? Right? Do they get to then tamper with the post office, or do they have to like go and sneak into my mailbox in my home? Right? We have a conversation here about how much proof and how widespread this surveillance can be. But I think that's different from saying, yeah, and we're going to just blanket stop all communication on this subject. That's not something that we've done in postal mail. That's not something that we've done in terms of person-to-person communication. So I think there are some lines that are worth pushing for as a thing that we want to have in this communication medium, I guess. Cool. Thanks, everyone.